Well, it is very, very pleasant to be back in Ohio, to be back at Ashland, to be with Peter Schramm, this giant of a figure on the landscape of American political thought, and to look out and see so many fresh, eager young faces who, of course, are probably here because they're compelled to. And I'm also glad to see so many other people here. I don't think any of my relatives are. So that means that most of you must be creditors. I will try to elude you as skillfully as possible. I do not want to talk about Lincoln so much today as I want to talk about this event we're sort of in the middle of here, and that is the 150th anniversary of the American Civil War, the sesquicentennial of the Civil War. And I want to pose a question which continues to nag at us even after 150 years, and that is this question: was the Civil War a second American Revolution? That's sometimes answered in a very superficial and hasty fashion because we have a superficial and hasty definition of what a revolution is. And so we leap up to say, well, yes, it was a big event. Well, not every big event is a revolution. Not every revolution is a big event. Was the American Civil War a second American Revolution? It's important to answer that question because Americans love revolutions. Our national identity began with a revolution, and a revolutionary war that lasted for 8 years. We cheer on other people's revolutions, like the Arab Spring, as though we find satisfaction in multiplying our own. I hold that a little rebellion now and then is a good thing, and as necessary in the political world as storms in the physical, wrote Thomas Jefferson. No country should be so long without one. And then much later, a very excited James Garfield, an Ohioan, in his maiden speech in the House of Representatives in 1864, asked whether his colleagues had forgotten that the Union had its origin in revolution. Ralph Waldo Emerson thought of revolution as the authentic instinct of humanity. Whenever a man comes, there comes revolution, he said in his Harvard Divinity School address of 1838. The old is for slaves. But sometimes our enthusiasm for revolutions blinds us to what is and what is not genuinely revolutionary. The English geologist and traveler, do what I want, there it is. I'm sorry, I talk to these machines. I know it's figurative, but it provides a certain emotional release. I should assure you that I do endeavor to use decent language in the presence of machines. The English geologist and traveler George Fanshawe took the temperature of American revolutionary fervor and dismissed it as mere patriotic puff. Designed, as he said, only to stimulate that national vanity and self-sufficiency which are often so conspicuous in young countries, and to cherish in his fellow citizens that inflated feeling of superiority over other nations. Oh, we began with a revolution, not like you. So let's be clear then what a revolution is. A revolution we may not get a revolution, but we might get a volcanic explosion. Is there a particular, what am I doing wrong here? Do I have to do it? Oh, that's it.
We're looking at it.
Other button? Maybe if I just throw it? Well, that's not the one I want. I want to go back.
Ben, can you help? Ben's coming. He's coming.
Ben! You want me to use the keyboard? You want me the arrow keys? Right. Notice he didn't give me that in the first place. Well, you know, evil to him who evil thinks. All right, well, anyway, a revolution, what is it? Revolution, I'm going to do something history people, like myself, are not really supposed to do very often and not really qualified to do, unless I'm going to borrow from political scientists. That's dangerous because political scientists speak an entirely different language from historians. It's a kind of sophalalia. I've never been able to understand it myself personally, but be that as it may. A revolution, if we're looking at this analytically, is an overturning. It's a reversal of polarity. It is a radical discontinuity, and I want to emphasize that word discontinuity with what has gone before. It means not only mass mobilization and regime change, but also more or less rapid and fundamental social, economic, and or cultural change during or soon after the struggle for state power. Now, stacked against that definition, our founding revolution and the revolutions which succeeded it may not be so revolutionary after all. At first, the American Revolution presents us with a whopping set of discontinuities. The King of England disappears and is replaced by a notion of sovereignty residing in the people. Democratic governments emerge in the new American states, and they coalesce in this unprecedented piece of formal statecraft, the Constitution. The property of prominent American Tories is confiscated. Law codes have to be rewritten. And a major debate takes place over whether even English common law should still retain authority in the American Republic or be superseded by legislative statute. That sounds like discontinuity to me. But much of this revolutionary reshaping happened not as an attack on the monarch, as the French did in their revolution, but simply by elevating the revolutionaries' already in place experiments in self-government to permanent status. The great Massachusetts orator, Daniel Webster, said, "We began our revolution already possessed of government and comparatively of civil liberty. Our ancestors had from the first been accustomed in a great measure to govern themselves. They were familiar with popular elections and legislative assemblies and well acquainted with the general principles and practices of free governments. They had little else to do than to throw off the paramount authority of the parent state. Enough was still left, both of law and organization, to conduct society in its accustomed course and to unite men together for a common object." In 1843, when one of the last survivors of Lexington and Concord was interviewed by an over-anxious antiquarian about his reasons for revolution, about why they showed up on Lexington Green and at Concord Bridge, in reply, Captain Levi Preston of Danvers, Massachusetts, replied simply, "Young man, what we meant in going for those red coats was this. We always had governed ourselves, and we always meant to. They didn't mean we should." In other words, our revolution was a revolution against a revolution, and in defense of an already existing, albeit de facto, democratic order. The real revolution, we might want to say, was the attempt of the King of England to meddle in those arrangements. This ambivalence about revolutions and what makes for a revolution in American history has never been more of a problem than when we speak of the American Civil War, as we often do, as a second American Revolution. And especially when we're situated, as we are, midway through the sesquicentennial of the Civil War. James Garfield believed that in 1864, that our situation affords a singular parallel to that of the people of Great Britain in their great revolution of the 17th century. Thaddeus Stevens hoped that the Union forces would free every slave, slay every traitor, burn every rebel mansion, and make the war a radical revolution. And nearer our own time, progressive historians in the 1920s and the 1930s warmed to the notion of the Civil War as a revolution which, according to Charles Beard, an industrial and commercial nation following in the footsteps of Great Britain was transformed by the power of capital, both absolute and as compared to land. And Beard did not think that was a good development. Well, certainly there exists, if we're talking about the Civil War and revolutions, quite a long list of discontinuities with the American past, which the Civil War opened up in American life, in the technology of war, in law and politics, in social relations and economics, and culminating in the abolition of slavery. But do these discontinuities amount to a revolution? Are they really even discontinuities? The most obvious of these discontinuities in the Civil War have to do with the war itself, or rather the technology of war. Because the received wisdom in the military history of the Civil War for the past half-century has been that the seemingly endless casualty lists of Civil War battlefields were the product of a revolution. The product of unimaginative officers attempting to use the outdated tactics of Napoleon against the decimating wonder of the newly invented rifled musket and rifled artillery. And this technology really was remarkable in many ways. Unlike the trusty old British Brown Bess musket of the 18th century, which was useless at ranges of greater than 80 yards, the Civil War era rifle musket could hit an 11-inch bullseye at 350 yards and could penetrate 6 inches of pine board at 500 yards. But the rifle musket was not exactly a novelty by the time the American Civil War broke out. It received its first practical tests in North Africa in 1846, in the Crimean War of 1854 to 56, and in the North Italian War of 1859. And it had attracted quite enough use and attention for two American officers, George Willard and Cadmus Wilcox, both of whom fought at Gettysburg, to write handbooks on its use. And for all the improvements in range and accuracy created by the new technology of the rifle musket, the weapon still was a black powder, paper cartridge, muzzle loader, which required a cumbersome sequence of 9 separate steps, known as load in 9 times, to load the thing. Although the optimum firing rate was 3 rounds per minute, the practical reality under battlefield conditions was closer to 1 round every 4 or 5 minutes. Moreover, the fabled improvements in accuracy of the rifled musket were also fatally limited. The rifling in the barrel, which gave its bullets a self-correcting spin, also slowed its velocity significantly compared to the old Brown Bess, from 1,500 to 1,115 feet per second, and thus allowed the bullet fired by the rifle musket to drop as much as 14 feet over 300 yards. That in turn required the installation of back sights on the various brands of rifle muskets, which forced the shooter to raise the rifle upwards before firing, And in effect, the bullet was not so much fired as it was dropped. And this dropping is echoed in numerous Civil War descriptions of combat where the bullets are said to have dropped in showers. So whatever was gained in terms of pinpoint targeting had to be paid for by continuous mental adjustments for the movement of targets. And the actual environment of combat was not a place conducive to careful mental adjustments. What precision of aim or direction can be expected? Asked one British officer. When one man is priming, another coming to the present, a third taking what is called aim, a fourth ramming down his cartridge, and all the while the whole body are closely enveloped in smoke and the enemy totally. And the answer to that question was, of course, not much. After the Battle of Stones River, Union Major General William S. Rosecrans worked out a general estimate of how many shots needed to be fired to inflict one hit on the enemy, and came up with the astounding calculation that 20,000 rounds of artillery fired during that battle managed to hit exactly 728 men. Even more amazing, his troops had fired off 2 million rifle cartridges and inflicted 13,832 hits on rebel infantry. You would not win a Cupid doll at the state fair. In practical terms, this meant that the Civil War was still the sort of combat where men could stand upright on the battlefield with a fairly healthy margin of safety. And the staggering length of the casualty lists was the result not of modernized technology, but of the inexperience of both volunteer officers and soldiers in charging home with what was still the queen of the battlefield, the bayonet, and the consequent bogging down of lines of battle in motionless exchanges of fire. Now, it could and has been argued that the Civil War was a revolution in modernized warfare in the form of other kinds of technology, such as railroad transportation and the electrical telegraph. But once again, the military applications of neither the railroad nor the telegraph were innovations of the American Civil War. Both were put to their first practical test by the British Army in the Crimean War. And in 1859, the Emperor Napoleon III took the railroads one step further and used them for troop transportation to northern Italy against the Austrians and the Hungarians. There was still an Austro-Hungarian Empire, but Peter remembers it. So, one of my students in class made a very astute observation the other day, although it had nothing to do really with the Civil War. It was about the Chicago Cubs. I don't know if any of you are Cubs fans. If so, place your hands over your ears. But she said that it was remarkable to reflect on the fact that the last time the Cubs won the World Series, the Ottoman Empire was still in existence. That's what we spend 4 years on history majors for. So they can make observations like that. Anyway, French railroads succeeded in moving 76,000 troops in just 10 days in the North Italian War. And in the run-up to the battles at Magenta and Solferino, it took some of Napoleon's regiments only 5 days to reach their concentration point in northern Italy from Paris. This is before the American Civil War. On the other hand, the last resort for promoting the Civil War as a technological revolution is almost always the famous combat of the Monitor and the Merrimac, the two great ironclad warships of the Civil War. Or perhaps I should refer to them as the Monitor and the Virginia, since at the time they fought their battle, what had been the United States steam frigate Merrimac had been rebuilt by the Confederates into an ironclad warship, which they named the Virginia. And this, of course, took place at their great battle at Hampton Roads in the spring of 1862. Well, one point for revolutionary novelty does get scored by this battle at Hampton Roads. It was the first time that two ironclad warships fought each other. But the decades between Trafalgar and Hampton Roads had seen at least 5 different innovations in naval technology. The use of steam power to replace sail, the use of explosive shells rather than solid shot, the screw propeller, rifled guns, in addition to iron armor, none of which originated in the United States, much less in the Civil War. During the Crimean War, both France and England constructed flotillas of ironclad floating batteries for use against their Russian antagonist. And in 1860, the British launched the first full-size sea-going iron warship, HMS Warrior. It was with Warrior that the real age of the iron warship arrived. Even the Monitor's ingenious revolving turret followed the lead of the British gunnery expert Captain Cooper Coles, who had patented a design in 1859 for an armored cupola on a turntable and conducted trials on a prototype in September of 1861. Well, if the Civil War was not exactly a revolution in military affairs, then perhaps we could say that it was such in law and politics. And again, on first opening the box, the Civil War does seem to have achieved 3 vital reconstructions of the old Constitution in terms of the abolition of slavery by the 13th Amendment, the definition of citizenship and voting rights in the 14th and 15th Amendments, and the first use of presidential war powers by Abraham Lincoln. But the 13th Amendment abolished an institution whose extinction, as Lincoln and many others had been at pains to demonstrate, which was already in the constitutional cards at the time of the founding. And the 14th and 15th Amendments involved repairing an oversight in the original Constitution, which oddly enough contains no definition of national citizenship, and thus overturning the attempt of the Supreme Court to impose a definition in the infamous case of Dred Scott versus Sanford in 1857. Lincoln's claim to possess, by virtue of his constitutional designation as Commander-in-Chief, certain unenumerated war powers was also a constitutional novelty. And in the minds of the Democratic opposition, who had their newspapers shut down and their leaders arrested and tried by military tribunals acting under those war powers, they seemed like a monstrous aberration. But one has to say, on the whole, that the volume of civil liberties violations during the Civil War pales by comparison with those which occurred during the 2 world wars and even into the War on Terror. Not until World War II would the United States gradually slide towards a semi-permanent state of military mobilization and the creation of what has unflatteringly been described as the national security state. That has not discouraged the more ambitious among us from claiming that in fact a bright line can be drawn between Lincoln's use of executive power and what is often construed as a centralizing revolution in federal government authority. Since the hallmarks of the centralized nation state are, according to the libertarian political philosopher Murray Rothbard, strong central government, large-scale public works, and cheap credit spurred by government. And since Lincoln's administration was also built on high tariffs, huge subsidies to railroads, public works, then, ergo, Lincoln had to be the forerunner of figures as various and presumably nefarious as Otto von Bismarck, Franklin Roosevelt, and Karl Marx. Lincoln, concludes the libertarian writer David Gordon, like his Prussian contemporary Otto von Bismarck, sought a powerful centralizing state. And if that's not a revolution, what is? Well, if this was indeed Lincoln's intent, to stage a quiet overthrow of the old Constitution and substitute the template for a Wohlfahrtsstaat or Sozialstaat on the model of Bismarck, well, that would be a genuinely revolutionary development. But the attempt to portray the Lincoln administration, even in the midst of the Civil War, as the New Deal before its time, really strains credulity. True, the United States federal budget swelled from a mark of $76.8 million in 1860 to an astounding high of $1.9 billion in 1865, but it plummeted immediately thereafter, back to $424 million, fully half of which involved the payment of soldiers' pensions. And by 1880, the federal budget was only 16.7% of what it had been in 1865. The federal civilian workforce rose from 40,000 in 1861 to 194,000 in 1865. But it, too, dropped precipitately by 1871 back to 51,000. If that amounts to a revolutionary centralization of government, then we've really begun to lose our grip on what we mean by a revolution. Curiously, where a debate over the revolutionary nature of the Civil War really came to front stage was in the justification the Southern states offered for their attempt to leave the Union, and that was their claimed right to secede. Lincoln never questioned the right of the Southerners to stage a revolution. Whenever American citizens shall grow weary of the existing government, Lincoln said, they can exercise their constitutional right of amending it or their revolutionary right to dismember or overthrow it. But one thing they could not do, Lincoln added, was to pretend that the Constitution gave them authority to leave the Union and proceed as though they had changed nothing in the process. The states have their status in the Union, and they have no other legal status, Lincoln insisted. If they break from this, they can only do so against law and by revolution. And the irony of this is that the one thing Southerners would not dare to do was to claim that their attempted departure from the Union was revolutionary. Because in that case, all legal bets would be off. The status of contract, court systems, postage stamps, state constitutions, and above all, property in the environment of a revolution would come into doubt, just as they had done after the triumph of the American revolutionaries in 1783. And property, of course, would include slave property. So the Confederates were compelled to claim that their movement was not a revolution, but a secession, and thus kept up the appearances of continuity with the past, rather than run the risks involved in revolution. If the Civil War was a revolution, even in this constitutionally arcane sense, it was a revolution in which the protagonists were surprisingly intent on denying that a revolution was occurring. But certainly we should say the Civil War was revolutionary in one overwhelming respect, and that was the emancipation of 3.9 million black slaves. And here we do strike a genuinely discontinuous revolutionary note. For the Civil War not only excised all legal traces of slavery from the federal Constitution, but practically destroyed all the wealth invested in it to the tune of nearly $3 billion. But was the overall goal of emancipation actually a revolutionary one? We tend to think of slavery today almost purely in terms of race, as a racial offense and a racial injustice, to be remedied only by full social and political equality. And in that sense, emancipation was a revolution. For in the long history of Western society, it was without precedent for a slave population of such magnitude to be absolutely and immediately emancipated without compensation to its owners, and then boosted at once into the realm of citizenship. But in the eyes of the emancipationists, racial redemption was not, in fact, the principal goal. The fundamental offense posed by slavery in their eyes was that it represented a step away from a democratic political order and its replacement with the kind of romantic aristocracy which had reestablished itself in Europe after the French Revolution. The kind of genteel aristocracy of thousand-bale cotton planters, which you get a remarkably good whiff of in Gone with the Wind. Except, of course, that slavery was not in the slightest bit genteel. What Lincoln hated in slavery was not just its racial injustice, but the reemergence in America of the old demon of monarchy, where some people were born with uncalloused hands, booted and spurred and ready to ride on the backs of everyone who had to work. Owning slaves, Lincoln complained, betokened not only the possession of wealth, but indicated the gentleman of leisure, who was above and scorned labor. And he was appalled at the way that it appealed to thoughtless and giddy-headed young men who looked upon work as vulgar and ungentlemanly. Slavery's tendency to promote aristocratic habits and aristocratic attitudes and aristocratic ways of thinking politically made Lincoln regard slavery as the one retrograde institution in America. Not because it was racially unenlightened so much as because it was fatally violating the noblest political system the world ever saw. So if there was a revolution taking place in the Civil War years, it was a revolution by the slave-holding aristocrats of the South against the principles of the Declaration and the Constitution. And this was not just Lincoln's perception either. Ulysses S. Grant was moved by the fear that democracy in America was regarded as a fragile and unwelcome experiment up to the breaking out of the rebellion, and monarchical Europe generally believed that our republic was a rope of sand that would part the moment the slightest strain was put upon it. At the other end of the chain of command, Wilbur Fisk, who enlisted as a private in the 2nd Vermont Infantry, likewise believed that slavery has fostered an aristocracy of the rankest kind, and unless it was rooted up, it would choke the last stand of democracy. Walt Whitman, the good gray poet, who found part-time government work in Washington so that he could serve as a nurse in the Army hospitals, wrote in 1863 that a divided America would reduce the world's greatest experiment in democracy to the level of a banana republic, which would then lie prone at the feet of England and France. The Democratic Republic, groaned Whitman, had mistakenly granted the united wish of all the nations of the world that her union should be broken, her future cut off, and that she should be compelled to descend to the level of kingdoms and empires. So long as the war raged, Whitman believed, There is certainly not one government in Europe but is now watching the war in this country with the ardent prayer that the United States may be effectually split, crippled, and dismembered by it. The prevailing ideal in the eye of Lincoln and almost every other opponent of slavery worth itemizing was to stuff the evil genie of slavery back into the southern box so that it could not spread, and then transform the society of the Old South into a competitive society of small businesses and benevolent churchgoers. The whole fabric of Southern society must be changed, urged Thaddeus Stevens, who was impatient of any result of the Civil War which did not include discontinuity. But the discontinuity Stevens had in mind was the establishment of continuity with the capitalist democracy of the North. How can Republican institutions, free schools, free churches, free social intercourse exist in a mingled community of nabobs and serfs? If the South, said Stevens, is ever to be made a safe republic, let our lands be cultivated by the toil of the owners or the free labor of intelligent citizens. The South would thus be remade, and remade into the image of a New England landscape with small factories, free enterprise, banks, schools, and wages. I look to a popular education so advanced that under impartial law, all creeds and all tongues and all races shall be gathered together with an equal protection, explained Wendell Phillips. The great trouble of the South lies in its ignorance. Awake it to enterprise. Promoters of emancipation were not bent on promoting a revolution so much as they were intent on snuffing one out. A backwards-looking, aristocratic revolution. And to putting the South back on the track it should have been on from the beginning of the Republic. The search for a revolution inside the American Civil War is sometimes, as George Fanshawe might have warned us, sometimes simply a search for something novel to say about an American event. So we call things revolutions. Sometimes, however, the search for a second American Revolution is the offspring of a question which bedeviled Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, and which bedevils historians of a Marxist persuasion today. It is the question posed by Werner Sombart a century ago. Why is there no socialism in America? For many people who want to find in the Civil War a second American Revolution, behind that quest is the desire to find some kind of usable past that would point toward a socialist future. So the question comes, why, in the land of the American Revolution, is there no interest in a social revolution of the classes? Well, the answers on offer since then have been many and various, but one answer to Sombart's question, which has been overlooked, may be Lincoln and the Civil War itself. Why is there no socialism in America? Perhaps one of the answers should be because of Lincoln and the Civil War. Lincoln and the Civil War imparted to the idea of democracy a nobility and a moral grandeur that democracy has sometimes lacked. Democracy engenders respect, but not enthusiasm or adoration. After all, democracy assumes that the humblest of citizens is competent to participate in governing. Of course, if the humblest of citizens turns out to be a bore, a simpleton, or a redneck, then democracy will quickly begin to lose its luster. Just as you have discovered at the last school board meeting you attended. Or maybe it was the last borough council, or maybe you've just been reading the newspapers. But you can lose an enthusiasm for democracy very quickly by watching how it operates and who operates within it. And thus you may conclude that we really ought to have a more exciting, dramatic form of government. Every Southern Confederate is hoping, wherever they are, that that's the conclusion you will come to. Because the victory of the North over slavery was a moment in which democracy shed any appearance of the commonplace and the ho-hum. It was a moment when democracy was borne up on the wings of courage, self-sacrifice, and the soaring eloquence of one very humble but very extraordinary president. Democracy can be dreadfully ordinary, dreadfully slow-footed, sometimes even ignorant. All because it is, at the end of the day, about the interests of ordinary people, rather than about knights in armor and royalty in gold carriages. But Lincoln and the Civil War gave democracy the strength of giants and put into its hand the shining sword of freedom. Perhaps in looking to the Civil War for a revolution, we have mistaken the end for the means. For in the Civil War, what we got was not revolution, but freedom. Not discontinuity, but continuity with our founding. And freedom and the founding are worth having by revolutionary or by any other means. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
I'm told it, so it's question time.
Question. In other words, you get pressed hard.
Yes.
First with the students and then anyone else.
Well, in the words of yet another president in time of war, bring it on.
Please. Please, you don't have to look at me.
Dr. Guelzo, thank you for coming today.
Anybody that looks younger than I am as a student.
Quite possible.
I just have a question about you saying that Lincoln and the Civil War might have prevented some type of social revolution in America. Short years after, but beginning in the 1900s, the progressive moved in and kind of turned America towards a more democratic society and started implementing some of those, the income tax, the fair, equal out income stability. Now, how is that consistent? Because you said that some of the progressive movement started from the 70s after the Civil War?
Chronologically, yes. Yes. Progressivism, more or less, is a movement you can put brackets around between 1880 and 1920. But the question I would raise in return is this. Exactly what was it the progressives meant when they invoked democracy? I mean, when Theodore Roosevelt talked about democracy, when Woodrow Wilson talked about democracy, Charles Beard talked about democracy. When they used the word democracy, what did they mean by it? They did not, and they were very clear, they did not mean by it the mechanisms created by the founders in the 18th century. If anything, they were impatient and on occasion contemptuous of those mechanisms. Wilson probably had the most severe comments to make on the incapacity of the Constitution, the incompetence of the Constitution, when he said that the Constitution is a document harking back to the Newtonian mechanistic view of the universe and has been rendered out of date by a new, more organic, evolutionary, romantic model. And that is how we understand how change occurs. Instead of, as in Newtonian mechanism, discovering fixed laws of human behavior, which the founders really thought they were addressing. Instead, you realize that human beings and human societies change over time, and therefore their laws and constitutions have to be changed to meet those new times. Well, Wilson, Roosevelt, et al. Concluded, we are now living in these new times of the heyday of an industrial society, and therefore the old Constitution doesn't work. We need another way of doing government that we can call democracy. And Wilson's notion of democracy was that he, as the leader, that was his phrase, the leader, he as the leader would embody the aspirations and desires of the people and interpret those aspirations and desires as public policy. Because he was uniquely equipped. He was a PhD, remember. He was uniquely equipped to understand what the people wanted and needed, and he would provide it, top down. This could not be more unlike Lincoln's notion of democracy. When Lincoln talks about democracy, he catches it in one of those lapidary phrases he was so good at. My idea of democracy, what is it? My idea of democracy, he said very simply, is this, that when you have one man does not rule another man without that other man's consent. It's very simple. As I would not be a slave, he said, so I would not be a master. That expresses my idea of democracy. Whatever differs from that, to the extent of the difference, is no democracy. This is a very different concept. Lincoln understood himself as standing in a direct line with the founders. The progressives believed that they had moved beyond that, and that democracy had evolved into something different. Now, it's a pay your money, take your choice situation. If Wilson's understanding of society and human nature is correct, then go with the progressives. If Lincoln's was correct, then go with his. But it does offer a stark choice in fundamental visions of human nature and human government. And the progressives really do present us with some radical discontinuities. But this is a very different thing from suggesting that the Civil War does. The Civil War is not so much about discontinuity as is about developing and understanding genuine continuity. But we have had our discontinuity since then, and perhaps the progressives are an example of that, as they believed they had to be. Yes?
Thank you again for coming today. You just said that in your speech that the South wanted to separate itself from revolution.
Yes.
But wouldn't Alexander Stevens' cornerstone speech suggest that they were almost embracing the revolution? Given that Alexander Stevens said, yes, the founders meant what they said in the Declaration, that all men are created equal, but they were wrong.
That's correct, and that does sound pretty revolutionary, just as John Calhoun, 30 years before, it sounded pretty revolutionary, when he likewise suggested that the Declaration of Independence had been written embodying a mistake. That business about all men created equal, ooh, very bad, according to Calhoun. Well, I'm only too happy to accord Stevens and Calhoun the accuracy of their insight. What they really were proposing was revolutionary. What they could not do, however, was utter the word, and when they did, they got slapped down for it. Jefferson Davis, in his inaugural address as the Confederate president, was at pains to emphasize the distance between the Confederacy and revolution. Why? I mean, why not just throw it to the winds and say, hey, let's have a revolution. We're going to party like it's 1863. And why didn't he do it? And the answer, I think, is palpable. As soon as you utter the word revolution, then the entire structure of law, the entire assumptions of property and everything are all cast into doubt. And one thing Southerners would never, white Southerners would never bring themselves to do, was to cast doubt on the absoluteness of property in human beings. That, said Stevens, that's what the whole Confederacy, the whole Confederate experiment is about. It's about slavery. He was not shy about saying that. Apologists for the Confederacy then and now will attempt to dance around this question and say, well, you know, it was about these other issues, it wasn't really about slavery. I think what that testifies to is how uncomfortable they were then and are now at discovering that that's really what the Confederacy was about. But they want to say, well, no, it was about these other issues, states' rights, tariffs. Tariffs is not an issue you start a civil war over. I mean, you might have a nice fracas on the floor of Congress, some people might get their hair pulled, but that did happen, by the way. Fist fights on the floor of Congress. There was a great one between Galusha Grow of Pennsylvania and William Barksdale of Mississippi. And Grow really got his hands full of Barksdale's hair, but in an unexpected way because it came off. Barksdale wore a wig. They said of Congress in those days, in the late 1850s, that the only people in Congress not carrying a Bowie knife and a revolver were the people carrying 2 Bowie knives. I often say that to people who are, you know, woe is us, look at Congress today and say, well, you don't know what you're talking about. Let's go back to the 36th Congress, and there you've got quite a lineup of bozos. But to go back to Stevens, yeah, Stevens is not shy about putting slavery right at the center of things. And by doing so, what they had to insist was the inviolability of property and laws of property describing human beings. You can't have a revolution that calls that into question. And that's what they were really about. Not tariffs. You don't make war over tariffs. You don't make war over states' rights. Because states' rights is a wax nose. Everybody appeals to states' rights whenever it suits them. Southerners appealed to states' rights because they wanted the fugitive slave law enforced, thereby overriding the state rights of northern states not to surrender those fugitives. So when they wanted their fugitives back, Southerners forgot all about states' rights, and they wanted the national government to override states' rights. I mean, it all depended on whose ox was getting gored. Those were not the fundamental issue is the defense of slavery, and with it, the defense of white racial supremacy. And notions of racial supremacy, notions of human slavery, belong with aristocrats. They belong in the long, tawdry history of monarchies and dictatorships going back to the Black Forest. They do not belong in the American Constitution, and they do not belong in the Declaration of Independence. And under the umbrella of the Declaration and under the umbrella of the Constitution, there is only one question which is asked of people. Not what your religion, your language, or anything else is. It is, are you agreeable, do you swear to uphold that proposition that all men are created equal? You do that, you're in. Whether you're Hungarian, whether you're Irish, Swedish, I don't care what you are. You could be polka dot from Mars. But if you're willing and able to do that, that is what makes you an American. You know, it takes 1,500 years to make a Frenchman. But you can become an American in 20 minutes. All right? Because it's a rational assent to a proposition. That was what the founders were getting at. That's why they were creating an entirely new order in the world, novus ordo seclorum, because there had never been a political order like that, a political order indifferent to these supposed indelible characteristics of people. They said there are no indelible characteristics in people any more than there are indelible characteristics in matter. People, human nature is fundamental and the same everywhere, and it comes equipped not with aristocratic or non-aristocratic status, but with rights, inalienable, natural rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. If you want to pin your flag to that mast, says the American experiment, that's what's required of you. Not your language, not your race, not your national origin. Slavery could not live, it could not draw breath indefinitely in that environment. That environment was the death of slavery sooner or later. It could only hold its breath until it asphyxiated. Southerners promoted the idea that they could get away with it much longer than anyone might have thought. But at the end of the day, in 1860, they saw that the handwriting was on the wall. And when they saw that they could not prevail, they decided to throw democracy to the winds and do that most undemocratic of things, which is to take their bat and ball and go someplace else and try to leave. That is the negation of democracy. That is not an assertion of rights. That is not an assertion of democracy. Did I answer enough questions there? Yes, yes.
Yeah, so Lincoln in the Gettysburg Address calls that all men are created equal a proposition,
Yes,
like you say.
right.
Can you talk about the difference between calling it a proposition and calling it what the founders called it, a
A
self-evident?
self-evident truth. A self-evident truth is
Well, I
something...
hope we're recording this, because this is good, this is good, I want to hear this.
All right.
This is serious.
A self-evident truth is something which you are compelled to recognize as true, simply on its own standing. That there is something in the nature of human cognition which not only recognizes the existence outside of yourself of things in an empirical sense, but which at the same moment comes to a moral, ethical, and aesthetic judgment about that. So that I look at you and I see not only that you exist as an empirical reality external to myself, I also see that you are one handsome looking dude in a purple shirt, and you speak well, and all the girls should really be just shooting themselves for your sake. What have I done? Right.
Delusional.
Right. Well, I don't know, he's got, look at all the girls that are in the row with him. What have I done when I've said that? I've made not only a judgment about your real existence, but I've also made ethical and moral judgments as well, simultaneously. Because those are self-evident, because I can't help but make those kinds of judgments. That is the self-evidence that is described in Enlightenment philosophy, and especially in that species of Enlightenment philosophy that we associate with Scots philosophers, Hutcheson, Reid, and so on and so forth, from whom the American founders borrowed a tremendous amount, including the phrase self-evident. But if a truth is self-evident, how then can it be resisted? How then can someone, if this truth is self-evident, how can someone act contrary to it? How can I look at you and conclude, no, you're really an ugly-looking, bald-headed loser, all right? Just to be as ungenerous as I can be. How could I say that? Well, the fact is I could say it. I could say it because I have a will. And my will is not always at the beck and call of my intellect. The will can rise up and silence the intellect. The will serves any number of masters, and it can rebel against the intellect. It can, in other words, reduce what ought to be a self-evident truth to the status of a proposition that is debatable. What Lincoln is saying then in the Gettysburg Address is, this is the philosophical history of slavery. It should be self-evident to everybody that all men are created equal. But people have risen up and denied it. Even Jefferson, when he writes this in the Declaration of Independence, is of course writing this in the context of a document which is showing how King George III has not, in fact, recognized a self-evident proposition. So a self-evident proposition can be denied. There's a long philosophical history on this, too. I mean, this takes us back, for instance, to Plato, talking about the rule that you were not supposed to gaze at corpses. And Plato describes the character who tries not to gaze at the corpse, but just can't help himself, and then turns around, looks at it, and says to himself, there, damn it, now you've seen it. What motivates someone to do things like that? Why does St. Paul, why does Seneca say, I see the good and I see the evil. I should do the good, but I do the evil. So people have understood that in between the perception of self-evident truth and one's response to it, there falls the shadow of the will. And the will can corrupt. And Lincoln understood this. He used the illustration in one context of a Quaker minister and an Anglican priest in the Church of England. And the Quaker, of course, is giving the Church of England minister a very hard time. Well, where in the Bible do you find this? Well, where in the Bible do you find that? Where in the Bible do you find the other? Well, look at this. What about this passage? And always the Anglican is saying, well, I don't see it thus. Finally, the Quaker gets out a 5-guinea gold piece and lays it over the biblical text and says, do you see it now? There are ways in which the will can be corrupted. Lincoln's feeling is that what has happened here is that a truth to which we should give a self-evident response has been corrupted. And we've reduced it to the level of a proposition. But the proposition nevertheless remains rational, it remains true, it can be apprehended by everybody. Even St. Paul said that the Gentiles, the nations, understand the truth of God. But what do? They suppress it in unrighteousness. So there's an understanding even there that you can take something which is self-evident, people know to be true simply as a matter of natural law, but people can deny it, pervert it. They may be like that fellow who jumped off the Empire State Building, and by the time he'd fallen to the 36th floor, someone poked their head out the window and asked him how he was doing. His response was, so far so good. The end may not be pretty, but people can delude themselves. And people have deluded themselves on the issue of slavery. Try reading some of the pro-slavery literature. But they deluded themselves in very toxic ways that threatened the integrity of the American system. I mean, what after all is the alternative then? If all men are created equal is not a self-evident truth. I mean, Calhoun said it wasn't. Equality, he said, is something people earn. You earn your equality with other citizens. Well, then if it's earned, if it's something you acquire, what are the ways of its acquisition? That is where power rears its ugly head. And it is on that basis that all monarchies and dictatorships are based. That is the direction Calhoun was taking us. It was romantic, I mean with a capital R. It was romantic, and from that same poisoned chalice, thinker after thinker in 19th century and 20th century Europe drank, and thus gave us the wars and massacres and genocides that pockmark that history. Lincoln was arguing against all of that. A proposition, but one which should be self-evident. That it is not self-evident to the Confederates is why we are fighting this war. Yes, in the back.
Yeah, you're talking about the pro-slavery rhetoric. After the economic collapse in 1857, a lot of Southerners talked about how the evils of Northern capitalism, how employees could just be fired by their employers, and how they actually called it socialism, how the master-slave relationship was a very solid basis.
Wage slavery.
Could
Right.
we say that socialism in America died with the Southern Confederacy in 1865?
Well, some people have suggested that what the Confederacy represents is an early version of state socialism. And there have been historians, for instance, like Raimondo Luragi in his History of the Confederacy, who maintains that thesis. Most recently, John Majewski in his History of the Confederate economy, the Southern economy before the Civil War and then up into the Confederacy, and especially about railroads. John makes the same point. All right, maybe this is not full-blown socialism as we might expect to find it in the 20th century. But understand, in the 19th century, people were still sorting out the components of what socialism was supposed to be. Certainly what you find in the Confederacy is a regime which is not friendly to the emergence of a middle-class bourgeoisie, which regards trade and labor with contempt because it associates it with slavery. And above all, which uses race as a tool to recruit the loyalty of poor whites who, on a law of average basis, who have much more in common economically and in class terms with black slaves, but nevertheless, the lure of Herrenvolk democracy is used by the Thousand Bale planters to ensure the loyalty of poor whites because they can always say, well, you may be poor, but at least you're a white man. All right, again, this takes us back to a socialist mentality, because a socialist mentality at the end of the day is indistinguishable from a feudal mentality. I mean, socialism in the 19th and 20th centuries is not some new breakthrough in political thought. It is a break back. It is a break back to feudalistic notions of social construction, only now with bureaucracy replacing the class or the caste system that dominated feudalism. So in that respect, what the Confederacy is looking to do is to dial back everything that had happened in the great age of democratic revolutions. No surprise, almost every despot in the 20th century had the same ambition. Whether it was Stalin or whether it was Hitler, who was, after all, remember, the apostle of the NSDAP, the National Socialism of Germany. In that respect, many people, especially in Europe, have understood democracy to be this parenthesis, this period of transition, of destabilization between the old feudal past and the new socialist future. But fundamentally, the new socialist future and the old feudal past are built on the same assumptions of the inheritance of status rather than of rights. So is the Confederacy contributing to that? I would say so. I would hesitate to say, well, it is a socialist state, simply because there was no such thing as a socialist state per se in the 1860s. They wouldn't have known what that was, and I don't want to try to be anachronistic. But at the same time, the fundamental principle of hostility to bourgeois democracy and to liberal capitalism, that certainly is in place in the Confederacy. Yes?
In one of our senior classes right now, we're discussing the issue of democracy and democracy in America and racial equality and how slavery was affected by that. And we're reading Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America, and in there he expresses that democracy isn't always the answer to every problem, and especially in America, and that democracy increases racial inequality because people have the freedom to choose, and they're conditioned to believe that racial inequality is accepted. Would you agree, disagree?
Isn't it great when you're reading Tocqueville how much it sounds like yesterday? You keep reading in Tocqueville and you keep, it's like, oh my goodness, does this man have some kind of, long-term vision? He's able to peer through the telescope and see what we're doing today. Well, that's because Tocqueville had a remarkable understanding of the operation of democracy. Of course, understand what Tocqueville is trying to say. He's not trying to tell you that democracy is the cure-all for everything. He is going to be candid. Democracy has its drawbacks. Democracy, and first and foremost among it, is democracy tends to dumb things down. It always inclines toward the average and sanctifies the average. It also can exacerbate inequality because it leaves people free to be unequal. And the irony of this is that no one, and Tocqueville says this, is a great passage of Tocqueville, no one feels inequality more painfully than those who have become most approximately equal. The smallest thing suddenly becomes magnified. This, he says, this is one of the risks that democracy runs. But he's writing this as a friend of democracy, because he's writing this to be read in France to reassure the French, democracy will not kill you. All right? Democracy is not going to destroy you. Yes, it's got these problems, but if you look at how it's operating in America, it really is a remarkable thing. Embrace it. Embrace it. And he wants to persuade people that even with its faults, those faults are not nearly the kinds of faults that you found in the Ancien Regime or that you found in the French Revolution. So he's arguing as a friend this way. What I find peculiar is there is no point at which I can put my finger down and say that Lincoln ever read Tocqueville. That is surprising because Tocqueville is widely read in the United States. But it just seems to be one of those books that got past him. He had not come to Ashland University as a student. That's the answer. Okay. But if you, believe me, the hours you spend reading and studying Tocqueville are golden. So there's not a page in Democracy in America that will not reap you rich dividends of insight into the nature of democracy. Yes?
Thank you for coming. I think that what's been established so far, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that there needs to be a marriage between the rights of blacks and this establishment of the aristocracy amongst the Southerners. And you actually wrote on page 267 of Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation that Johnson, to Johnson, the Civil War had been fought to bring down the slave-owning aristocrats and free the non-slave-holding white yeomanry from their domination, but not to emancipate the blacks.
That's true. Emancipation was not an immediate goal. In fact, race is not the most immediate problem. It sounds very strange to do it, because today when we look back at the Civil War, we tend to look at it through the lens of everything that has happened since, including the Civil Rights Movement. And we want to think of the Civil War as this kind of gigantic early version of the Civil Rights Movement, which it wasn't. One reason I think we want to do that is because the reasons that people articulated in the 1860s for fighting in this war don't really send the blood pumping. If people say, if you read in their letters and diaries, we are fighting to preserve the Union, and we think, well, whoop-de-doo, that's really thrilling. Okay, well, that's not the kind of thing that gets you up in the morning. But understand what they were talking about. They understood in the 1860s what was clear and palpable before them, but which is less clear and obvious to us. And that is that in 1861, the United States is the last freestanding example of a functioning democracy in the world. Back in 1776, democracy looked like it was the coming thing. Jefferson and Washington could write about living in an age that was going to see an ever-increasing enlightenment of peoples who would embrace democratic republicanism. They were confident, they were optimistic about the future, because they felt that they had finally discovered the political order that tallied best with human nature itself. And all of that went up in a puff of Napoleonic smoke. Between 1803 and 1815, Napoleon betrays every aspect of that democratic revolution. Not, mind you, that the French themselves hadn't gone a ways toward that beforehand in the Reign of Terror, but Napoleon is the one who puts the icing on it. And then in response come these newly reactivated reactionary regimes under the Congress of Vienna, the Holy Alliance. It really looked as though democracy had taken a shot to the jaw that it richly deserved. And every king and every prince could point to the history between 1789 and 1815 and say, see, this is what democracy gets you. It gets you Napoleon, it gets you instability, it gets you anarchy. What do you want in life? Do you want 3 squares a day and a roof over your head? We can give you that. We have experience. And for people who have undergone all those years of warfare, that sounded like a good deal. That sounded like security. 1815 marks this turning of a tide against democratic revolution. And at every point between 1815 and 1861, where peoples in Europe attempt to revive that notion of democratic revolution, it is ruthlessly put down. In 1830, well, even 1825, the Decembrists in St. Petersburg, and ultimately then in the great revolutions of 1848. In 1861, when Lincoln looked around him, what he saw was the United States as this island of democracy. That was all that was left of the age of democratic revolutions. And if the United States obliged the monarchs by blowing its own brains out in a civil war, A civil war instigated on one side by people who were enthusiastically embracing the monarchical principle. There's no surprise that when you look at the broad spectrum of opinion in Europe during the Civil War, the monarchs loved the Confederacy. Leopold, the king of the Belgians, Leopold I, who was sort of the great uncle of all the European monarchical houses, Leopold I says that the American Civil War is an opportunity for the rebuilding of the aristocratic monarchical principle in America. And over again, Bismarck says to Karl Schurz, several decades later, we were all pulling for the Confederacy. Of course they were. They knew whose side they were on. They knew whose principles. The Junker class, whom Bismarck represented, is almost indistinguishable from the planter class of the Confederacy. Works in the same way. Even still had hereditary serfdom. So, what is at stake in the Civil War is whether democracy itself is going to survive. Whether democracy is doomed by this internal dissension, by this, you know, when you say that the governed, the consent of the governed is what is necessary to legitimate a political regime, well, the governed can be a very fractious quantity. And if the governed decide that, no, they want to do something different, we're going to fight about this, and we're not going to go along with this, blah, 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 then what all the monarchs and kings are saying, see, we told you so. We told you so. Now, look at the United States. Here's the ultimate, I told you so. You want democracy? This is what you're going to get. And Lincoln is saying, we have to prove them wrong. That is why at Gettysburg, when he says, you know, we were founded, we were dedicated to this proposition that all men are created equal. Now, he says, we are met on a battlefield of that Civil War, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. This is the final exam of democracy, folks. Because if the Americans can't make this thing work, then nobody can. If the Americans can't, and de Tocqueville comes to America because the Americans seem to be the pilot program for democracy. If the Americans whom de Tocqueville so much admire, if they can't make democracy work, then it's ipso facto inoperable. And we just have to live with that fact. And nobody will be experimenting with democracy afterwards. Of course, that doesn't happen. I hope we're grateful it didn't happen. Sometimes we need to remind ourselves. Sometimes we need to remind ourselves what a close-run thing it was. That democracy is not a given that just happens. And it nearly tumbled from being not just self-evident, but maybe not even a proposition. That was the threat the Confederacy posed. The dagger of the Confederacy was pointed not just at Northerners, not just at non-slaveholders. The dagger of the Confederacy was pointed at everyone who looked to democracy as the hope for the future. Because I, for one, would not want to live in a society of slaves. I would not want to live in a society that apportioned its humanity and its citizenship on the basis of non-rational categories like race. That's not a democracy anymore. We're back to the Middle Ages in that case.
May I follow up, please?
Oh, yes, I'm
And
sorry.
then we'll have one more question after that.
I was nattering off. Please, go ahead.
Oh, no, I definitely agree with you. But I'm wondering if Johnson's inability to kind of connect those equal rights with the disestablishment of the aristocracy, if you think that is what really caused the Reconstruction to be such a failure?
Andrew Johnson was a nincompoop. I don't really have a better word for it. You know, if you wanted a good brief against democracy, look to Andrew Johnson. Maybe there's a good reason there. You know, isn't it wonderful that Abraham Lincoln was the 16th president, not Andrew Johnson? The thought almost makes you choke. Andrew Johnson, there was a story of simple, raw, pure incompetence. And it's the kind of thing that makes you wonder out loud, where did they get him from? Well, you know, it seemed like a good idea at the moment, make him vice president. He was a Southerner, after all. He was the only Southern senator who had remained loyal to the Union. He'd been provisional governor of Tennessee. This looked like a way of saying that the Lincoln administration, when it comes up for re-election in 1864, is a nonpartisan, broadly based, let's all get along together kind of affair. So his being added to the ticket in 1864 was a way of undercutting the Democratic opposition in the North to Lincoln in 1864. No one had ever planned for him to be president. In fact, they almost instantly regretted it because the man gets up at his inauguration. This is the 4th of March, 1865, and in the usual protocols of things, the vice president is inaugurated first, then the president. So Johnson gets up to deliver his inaugural address as vice president, and he has a cold, you see, and he's been medicating himself with spiritus frumenti. And he launches into this long, unstable diatribe. It's so obvious that he's 3 sheets to the wind that the outgoing vice president, Hannibal Hamlin, who was sitting behind him, had to tug on the coattails of his frock up, sit down, sit down. And when Lincoln goes out onto the portico for his own oath of office, he remarks to the marshal in charge of the ceremonies, "Don't let Johnson speak outside." There's no record that Lincoln ever met with Johnson to talk about policy. I mean, Johnson was there to get a particular segment of the vote, not to become president. Now you know why Ford's Theater is important. Yeah. One more, did you say? This gentleman here? Yes.
Where do you think...
You're not wearing a tie. All these other people are almost all of them, but you know,
We don't know him.
were you doing it in honor of Mother? Oh. I didn't know whether it was. Well, I mean, some people.
I debated it earlier.
I say, all right, well, you look just fine.
I was wondering where some of the Southern generals, and mainly Lee, stand on like all of this, because Lee doesn't seem to me to be that kind of a staunch like Southern slavery proponent. He seems more of just he got caught in the whole issue of Virginia joining the side of the Confederacy.
Well, that's what he wanted you to think afterwards. And Lee was very good about promoting that image of himself. It's curious because Lee did not start the Civil War with a lot of optimism about the Confederacy. Lee understood very clearly that the weight, numbers, and resources of the North would, in the long run, grind the South to pieces. He knew that if the South didn't get in there and score a knockout in the first couple of rounds, they weren't going the distance. They couldn't last. So he kept saying this to Southerners. You're going to have to invade the North. You're going to have to win a smashing victory on Northern soil. You're going to have to do this in a dramatic way to knock the Northern public on the head. Well, they don't really listen to him all that effectively. And just before Appomattox, he throws his hands in the air and says, "I knew this was going to happen. I knew this was going to happen." But that doesn't mean that he wasn't heart and soul with it. It was precisely because he was heart and soul with it that he was always upbraiding the Confederate leadership for more effort. It's that leads him twice to invade the North, first in 1862, then in 1863. So Lee is by no means a sort of good Southerner, like a good German in the Second World War. No, he is, if anything, he is as fully committed to the slave system. I mean, he always, well, wouldn't it be great if one of these days we could get rid of slavery? But look, every Southerner talked that way, and nobody did anything about it. It's like the weather. Everybody talks about it, nobody does anything about it. And, you know, in this case, Lee is simply saying what Southerners over and over again, from Patrick Henry and Thomas Jefferson and James Madison all the way up to Appomattox, are saying the same thing. Wouldn't it be great if we could get rid of slavery? Well, you know, one of these days, and they go on and live with it. And they stage a war to promote it. And I don't have a lot of illusions, much less sympathies, for a number of the Confederate leaders. As Ulysses Grant said, and I think this is true, never did better men fight on behalf of a worse cause. And I think that is a true word. And I cannot look at the Confederate leadership with a lot of nostalgia. Because at the end of the day, they raised their hand against the Constitution and against the flag. When you do that, I'm sorry, you're my enemy. I don't care on what grounds you do it. I might be very sympathetic to the grounds on which we do it, but when you do it, you are my enemy because you have raised your hand against me at that point. And I have difficulty recognizing in the Confederate leaders people of such supernal nobility that we should have some kind of respect. I don't wish to defame anyone, but at the same time, what they did was treason. That is a terrible, blood-curdling word. But the Constitution defines treason as making or levying war on the United States. And that is what they did. And that was treason. They were my